Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll go back. Vernacular Architecture Forum was founded in 1980 as the premier organization in the United States dedicated to vernacular architecture studies. During the nascent years of VAF, it was a small yet welcoming forum open to multiple disciplines and exploration of new methods and subjects. More than 40 years later, this vision remains a cornerstone. Founding and early members of VAF produced studies that demonstrated the power of centering ordinary places and everyday people in the study and analysis of built environments. Using VAF publications and oral histories conducted in 2018 and 2019, my talk is focused on the path VAF has traversed over the last 4 decades. I will highlight core principles and activities, inflection points, new projects, recent articles, and questions that we are currently exploring. To frame this discussion, and as an introduction to my relationship to Vernacular Architecture Forum, I will first share the early stages of a research project that considers an ordinary building simultaneously as an archetype and as singular, pressing into relief a complexity otherwise easily obscured. In the United States, this building would be considered by many as vernacular. During the 1950s and 60s, the ranch house was a popular and soon-to-be ubiquitous form of suburban single-family housing in the United States. A majority of these houses were constructed in planned communities laid out on large tracts of land where each lot and low-slung rectangular building was part in a seemingly repetitive pattern of residential development. In the aggregate, these homes can be considered a topology with shared characteristics, features, common floor plans, and suburban landscape. Promoted as an affordable, inexpensive way to remove oneself from urban living and to achieve the American dream of single-family home ownership, the ranch house came to symbolize modern family living and success. While a large majority of ranch houses constructed in the United States during the 1950s and 60s were built in large quantities by developers on large tracts of land, other established patterns of construction continued and coexisted. These included contractors who built on a smaller scale or even single houses that were offered for sale, and individuals who constructed their own homes, some availing themselves of opportunities offered through the do-it-yourself housing industry, where companies such as Sears and Aladdin offered prefabricated and kit homes that could be ordered from a catalog. I recently commenced research into the history of a specific ranch house that was completed in 1960. I refer to the property as the Schrader Avenue House. Thus far, I am considering the Schrader Avenue House as both archetype and a singular, as I mentioned previously, which allows for consideration of the interplay between cultural and social symbolism exemplified in the archetype and one individual's use and reference to it as a proclamation of belonging and demonstration of resilience. On April 25, 1956, a gentleman named Ben Morrow purchased 2 unimproved lots for $1,100 US in a small municipality within the jurisdictional boundaries of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is located in the eastern United States. The roughly quarter-acre piece of land was part of a recently subdivided 17-acre tract, and lots were on sale for individual purchase. 2 days later, after purchasing the lots, Ben transferred the property through a legal agreement to a gentleman named William for $1, followed by a deeded transfer 1 month later. The purchase price was $1,100, the same amount that Ben had paid for the property. His total profit was the $1 paid as part of the preliminary transfer. By the 1950s, this area where the house was located was known as Oakland and was considered a desirable suburb for families. Geographic location was one factor that contributed to Oakland's desirability. The star on the map is the Oakland, and the central area with where the rivers come together is Johnstown. Johnstown was a small industrial city with a population just under 54,000 in 1960. It was home to the nationally significant Canberra Iron Works, which was later subsumed by Bethlehem Steel, and the city was also home to a competing steel manufacturer, U.S. Steel. Local mining operations supported the manufacturing production. The central part of Johnstown is located in a low-lying, narrow valley at the confluence of 2 rivers. The soot and smells of industry were often trapped within these confines. The surrounding steep topography also made Johnstown susceptible to flooding. The most devastating flood occurred in 1889. This man-made disaster was caused by the collapse of a dam located approximately 12 miles east of the city. The catastrophic failure released 20 million tons of water that roared into the valley, killing more than 2,000 people. It was the largest man-made disaster in the United States at the time. The event has been memorialized as a unit of the U.S. National Park System and subject of a book by well-known U.S. historian David McCullough. Johnstown would suffer another less calamitous, yet notable flood in 1936, and yet another in 1977. Oakland, where the Schrader House is located, was only 3 miles outside of the city, but it was at a higher elevation, far above the high water mark and further away from the environmental impacts of heavy industry. William had grown up in Prospect, a poor section of Johnstown, located near the Cambrian ironworks, so within that kind of industrial landscape. It was not considered desirable for environmental and social reasons. And at some point after marrying, he moved his family to a rental property located within an area that was poor and not considered desirable, but with less detrimental environmental issues. In 1956, William had procured financing to make an offer on a property located in a nearby, more desirable area that was located outside the city limits, although surrounded by the city. This is an image of that area called Daleboro in 2018. The area was made up of working-class households where he made his offer. The owner declined to sell to William and sold the property soon thereafter to another purchaser for the exact price he had offered. The deed did not have a racial covenant, and there is no tangible evidence that the refusal of William's offer was racially motivated. However, historically, Johnstown was a segregated city. Exclusionary practices were common at the time, and the Fair Housing Act, which made discriminatory housing practices illegal in the U.S., would not pass for another 12 years. Determined not to be excluded from an everyday practice and right availed to others, William, with the help of his friend, had flipped the power dynamic that restricted him from owning a home in a place he could afford and wanted to live. His actions caused a disruption in a local practice of exclusion, and he privileged himself the possibility of establishing a home in the place of his choosing. Now that he had the land, he needed to build a house. While neither carpenter nor contractor, William purchased plans of a ranch house that he and his wife had admired from afar during road trips, and built a house on the property by hand over the course of 4 years, using traditional wood frame construction methods and not prefabricated components or a kit. This is two pictures of the house under construction. It's not clear whether the decision to build by hand was financial or based on a principle or other factors. However, it is apparent that it was a slow, difficult, and at times unpleasant and possibly dangerous process. His lack of experience in construction was certainly a factor, and he faced threats and destructive actions by neighbors who did not want him or his family to move in, and the refusal of some businesses to sell him building supplies. Nonetheless, William carried onward. He modified the plans with the addition of a one-car garage and made adjustments to accommodate the topography of the site. In many respects, the house that he built was an unremarkable ranch house based on a standard layout that could be found in the do-it-yourself catalogs. This is very close to the layout of the house. I don't have original drawings. However, use of space reflected an earlier era, with the kitchen treated as back of house function, not open to the living or dining, and certainly not to guests. Interior finishes were an intermixing of older construction traditions, such as lath and plaster and hardwood floors, yet the furnishings were distinctively modern. On the exterior, the horizontal form was bisected, and the overall massing dominated by a slightly out-of-scale gray sandstone fireplace and chimney that visually anchored the house to the site and gave the structure a sense of permanence. The design decision pathway for constructing the house is unknown to me and may remain so. However, what I have discovered about the history of Schrader Avenue House and have experienced has led to a clearer understanding of a complex ranch house that on the surface appears typical, and the neighborhood where it was built, the family who lived there, and the person who built it. It is also an example of how social practices, environmental factors, cultural phenomena, and other influences often intersect and can manifest in the built environment. In 1995, Thomas Hubka, an early member of the Vernacular Architecture Forum, wrote an article entitled "The American Ranch House, Traditional Design Method in Modern Popular Culture." In it, he characterized the post-World War II ranch house as a hybrid, arguing that it provided a reconciliation between the forces of vernacularism and modernism. He stated that on the one hand, the pattern of living for the inhabitants of ranch houses followed a traditional kitchen-dominated lifestyle and emphasized the separation of formal and utilitarian spaces. And on the other hand, the minimalist qualities of more openness and stripped-down appearance of living areas, which offered minimal trim, wall-to-wall carpeting, and low ceilings, came to be associated with the image of efficient, sensible, modern living that was the overwhelming choice of Americans buying homes after World War II, and owed much to modern means of production. You can kind of see how the Schrader Avenue house doesn't quite fit within that building tradition, but really is connecting to the symbolism. Hubka's interpretation of the ranch house is built upon his documentation and study of numerous neighborhoods and houses located throughout the United States. I have found this view of the ranch house as a reconciliation, a useful lens for analyzing Schrader Avenue House that uncovers additional forces not visible at the level of typology that also are present in the history of other types of homes across the United States. The Schrader Avenue House was a reconciliation, but between the forces of exclusion and individual rights, where the owner-builder leveraged traditional methods of land exchange and construction, and a symbol of modern class living that in practice altered a social landscape for more than 50 years. During this half century, the family who lived here occupied a liminal space of being a part of and apart from the place where they lived. As such, the Schrader Avenue ranch house was a tangible and symbolic demonstration of validity for their presence in this place. Future additional research and analysis will likely unveil other houses representative of similar social and cultural practices manifested in the built environment. The topic of housing during various eras and locations throughout the United States and beyond is common in vernacular architecture studies in the United States and elsewhere, and within the VAF. It is, however, new to me and was not the topic that led to my involvement with Vernacular Architecture Forum. Introduction started with a paper presentation at the Vernacular Architecture Forum annual conference in Portland, Oregon, in Western United States, while a graduate student studying under the tutelage of a VAF founding member. My work at the time focused on the spatial history and practices of incarceration in the United States during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. My paper analyzed a specific institutional landscape, no longer extant, through a post-structuralist lens. The piece was undoubtedly viewed by some as outside the realm of vernacular architecture studies. It lacked traditional fieldwork and was steeped in theory. However, the material, spatial, and geographical aspects of the carceral landscape were central, as well as the experiential and cultural meaning, and the archival research was extensive. The methodology, analysis, and focus on the everyday built environment made it a fit for VAF. The young, forward-looking group of men and women who founded the Vernacular Architecture Forum shared mutual interest in the study and analysis of the built environment as artifacts of material culture and in ordinary buildings and landscapes, with fieldwork and documentation essential to their endeavors. Together, they established a forum for the exchange, sharing, and support of work rooted in vernacular architecture studies and named it the Vernacular Architecture Forum. They represented sundry disciplines and purposefully left the edges and fabric of the organizational umbrella unbounded and inclusive. Formation of the VAF was preceded by informal gatherings of a smaller group of these young professionals in the early stages of their careers, who conducted fieldwork as part of their jobs or other research. They lived in relatively close proximity to one another in the United States, in Virginia and Maryland, a region often referred to as the Chesapeake. One of the participants recalls that during these times they shared and critiqued each other's field drawings. Interestingly, two members of this group, Carrie Carson and Carl Lounsbury, also held membership in VAG at the time, which had formed 27 years earlier. Encouraged by faculty member at nearby George Washington University, Del Upton, a member of the Chesapeake Group, issued the Vernacular Architecture Newsletter, or VAN, in 1979. Published quarterly, the newsletter was intended to facilitate exchange of research, bibliographies, and ideas more broadly. Issuance of VAN was soon followed by an organizing meeting in Washington, D.C. that included participants from a larger geographic area, and the inaugural meeting of the organization was held the following year in the adjacent state of Maryland. By most accounts, VAF, the organization, was formally organized sometime between those two meetings. But during a 3-year period spanning 1979 to 1982, this local ad hoc group would grow into the VAF with an annual conference and publication that would become a flagship of the organization. In 1982, VAF launched Perspectives in Vernacular Architecture, an anthology of peer-reviewed essays based on papers presented during the first 2 annual meetings. Over the next 12 years, VAF published 8 more volumes of conference-based essays, and in 2004, the publication was turned into a refereed journal with content selected from open submission as well as conference papers. Early members of VAF recall a fun, small, slightly funded, flexible organization of approximately 50 or more people who were welcoming, supportive of one another's work, and generally pleased to engage with like-minded people. Much of the camaraderie was cultivated during in-depth tours to out-of-the-way buildings and landscapes, not frequently the subject of architectural studies at the time. The tours were supported with guidebooks developed specifically for sites visited and included measured drawings, information about the history of the buildings, including changes over time and the people who used them. The day-long tours were the early centerpiece of the annual conference, so much so that paper presentations were interspersed during the tours or tagged on to the end of the day after food and drink. By most accounts, this proved a pretty ill-fated sequence, counter to engaged listening and discussion, and the conferences were soon restructured to dedicate separate days to both. Today, more than 40 years later, VAF is a robust organization with a steady enrollment of more than 850 members, including several of the founders. Our annual conferences, which are held in different regions of the US every year, continue the tradition of day-long tours with a guidebook, paper sessions, and a general spirit of openness and inclusivity. The VAF also continues to publish the Vernacular Architecture newsletter and a journal. This is from our conference earlier this year. Two of the tours were the Cranberry Bogs in Massachusetts and Martha's Vineyard. These traditions, practices, and activities have not continued unchanged, and new threads have been woven into the fabric of the organization. Some changes have been gradual and other times made through targeted, decisive action. It is fair to say that some members from time to time questioned whether there has been too much change regarding certain aspects of the VAF, and others would argue that there has not been enough. While perceptions of the degree of change may vary, deliberate changes have occurred through mindful consideration of the founding principles that encompassed the range of subject matter and methods, as well as the social character of the organization that aimed to minimize hierarchy. The first editor of Perspectives in Vernacular Architecture, Camille Wells, introduced the maiden issue of the publication by situating the VAF within the canon of architectural history and other disciplines. And I will quote her a bit. Within the past decade, the study of vernacular architecture has expanded dramatically beyond the limits of antiquarian and nostalgic interest in old, quaint, usually rural buildings. To the extent, then, that the social sciences and humanities are concerned with patterns of human behavior, vernacular architecture is an important and until recently neglected field of investigation. Attendant to new understanding of the significance of common buildings has been the recognition that most structures fall well beneath the concerns of elite or polite architecture. As a result, a broadening range of buildings, factories, tract houses, farmsteads, and schoolhouses, as well as whole landscapes, mill towns, suburbs, agricultural settlements, and commercial strips have been usefully categorized and analyzed as vernacular architecture. These statements were equal part affirmation of what VAF was and assertion of what it was not. The inclusive definition of vernacular architecture that Wells posited illuminates a persistent philosophical grounding of the organization that has enabled change and continuity to coexist on the same stock. In some respects, the VAF tent was transforming almost immediately after it had been staked. By the mid-1980s, some members were questioning the validity or usefulness of the term vernacular architecture. In the introduction to Volume 2 of Perspectives, published in 1986, Wells delineated vernacular architecture in even less rigid terms, stating, "It is generally acceptable to define vernacular as common buildings of any sort." Wells further asserted that vernacular architecture has become, for many scholars, less a kind of building than an approach to looking at buildings. Unmooring vernacular architecture from a specific group of tangible resources was more redefinition than existential reckoning that opened the VAF's doors even wider. Wells characterized this moment as an opportunity, stating that vernacular architecture today is a mildly unstable and semantically indefensible mixture of evidence, method, and theory. It occupies a poorly worked out frontier where new and significant things are likely to occur. This viewpoint was reflected in the chapters of the volume, which included a diverse range of methodologies, topics, building types, and disciplines. In 1988, through an effort to define new directions for VAF, the Board of Directors reached a consensus that VAF's essential character included an archaeological approach to the study of ordinary buildings, but open to various disciplines and other types of artifacts, a commitment to field work, a scholarly interest group, but accepting of amateur members. Within the first decade of the organization's existence, VAF also established prizes and awards to recognize and promote exemplary work in vernacular architecture studies. In the early 2000s, as the 25th anniversary of vernacular architecture drew near, the board seized the impending milestone as an opportunity for critical reflection on the intervening years, the present and future of the organization, which culminated in a special issue of Perspectives in Vernacular Architecture. The organizational retrospective was placed front and center at the 2004 annual conference with a plenary session featuring Dale Upton as the invited speaker. A version of the talk was later included as an introductory essay in anniversary edition under the title, The VAF at 25, What Now? Recalling the 2004 plenary, the co-editors of the anniversary volume later noted that all involved had hoped that his presentation would be evaluative and challenging, and went on to say it was that and more besides. In the published piece, Upton acknowledged the progressive influence of vernacular architecture studies on more traditional architectural history. He also noted that a more sophisticated approach to the study of the built environment had developed within VAF. Interest had broadened, and that many people involved in the organization had adopted more ambitious analytical strategies derived from history, folklore, geography, art history, cultural studies, and any number of other disciplines. However, he also identified the beginning of a trajectory towards stagnation and asserted, I have always felt that the only way to do good work is to be dissatisfied with what one has done to date. But our new work is starting to sound a bit like our old work. Our intellectual arteries are hardening. Like the buildings and landscapes that we study, the VAF was created at a particular time within a specific set of circumstances that resulted in an expansive and progressive organization when it was formed. And like a building, we could try to preserve it as a representative example of that era, or we could revitalize and respond to the circumstances of the present and a projected future. Upton's piece was in many ways a call to action for VAF to reopen the doors to new approaches for studying everyday places and everyday people, for VAF to look forward, to not mire in the specifics of a time that had passed, to engage in the intellectual present and to, quote, re-stir the pot. It's worth noting that in 2006, the VAF board considered, but then dismissed a change to its name. The special 25th anniversary edition of Perspectives in Vernacular Architecture was the last issue of the journal. Later that year, VAF launched the inaugural issue of a new journal, Buildings and Landscapes, which some of you heard about last evening. We still offer, we call it the BNL, we just refer to it as BNL. BNL co-editors, Howard Davis, who's sitting right here, and Lewis Nelson saw the new name of the journal as reflecting a shift in vernacular architecture studies from the margins of scholarship about the built environment to its center, and no longer a subset of a larger field. The new journal would provide a larger, more inclusive platform for an even more diverse array of content. They specifically highlighted the study of the built environment outside of North America, as well as studies of the built environment that explored the dynamics of power and identity, analysis of human experience and perception, and the built environment as manifestation of and participant in social, cultural, political, religious, and economic processes. Davis and Nelson also affirmed that the study of everyday built environments through the close study of real buildings and real landscapes, as well as the investigation of the ordinary and the margins, would remain central. And they ensured readers that fieldwork and its many forms, which was foundational to the institution, would remain present in the content of the publication. The first issue of B&L featured articles on factories in Canton, Inca architecture in Peru, the erasure of local inhabitants' role in the construction of colonial Bombay, New York City's oyster barges, and creation of department store chains in Chicago. The editors expressed great enthusiasm for the new publication and put forth the intention to establish B&L as the primary peer-reviewed journal for scholarship and practice in vernacular architecture and the diverse fields of the built environment. As the VAF approaches its 45th anniversary, we are again, or perhaps I should say, we continue to examine the purpose, relevancy, and health of the organization in the present and work to ensure there will remain a strong underlayment for the future. Out of necessity, we've become a more complex organization with a 15-person volunteer board of directors, multiple committees, and a contracted conference coordinator, all done in the service of carrying out the responsibility we've inherited to stay true to the key principles and intent of the organization, while welcoming growth and a diverse array of new faces and ideas. Much of this effort has taken the form of focused outreach, increased access, and educational endeavors. The VAF continues to grant the awards and prizes established in the 80s and 90s, and has created additional awards and grants primarily to support the involvement of students and younger scholars, as well as fieldwork. The impacts of these efforts was clearly evident in our annual conference held earlier this year, where 23% of the conference registrants were students. These are just a few of them, many of whom were able to participate as recipients of VAF financial support through our awards and fellowships program. The paper topics were varied, expansive, and included challenges and methods in interpreting the material culture of enslavement, ephemerality, remembering marginalized community spaces, what gets lost, what gets remembered, and preservation, just to mention a few. The places represented within these topics were primarily located in North America. However, several papers focused on international landscapes and buildings constructed in Israel, China, Peru, and Indonesia. These are just some of the articles that were in our latest version of the journal that was focused on fieldwork and different ways and new ways of looking at fieldwork. I'm going to move through this so that I can get on time here to get to the last point that I have. Simultaneous to the focus on redefining how fieldwork is done, we have a joint Mellon grant with the University of Virginia. This grant is focused on a new field school program dedicated to documenting threatened African American cultural landscapes. And these are just two of the locations. The field schools occur over 3 years, and the first one has been in its second year, and the second one on the right at Bellevue is in its first year. Thank you.